行くよ。
Gundam Unicorn holds a very special place in my Gundam history for being the first Gundam entry I tried to watch. I understood absolutely nothing of what was happening, but the fights and mecha designs kept me going. And even though I had no context for what was happening, I enjoyed it enough to start delving more into the franchise, particularly Universal Century. A couple of years later, having watched almost all of early Universal Century, I can say that Unicorn is a good show. It's a part homage, part closure that reframes some conflicts of early UC, a final love letter to all of Zeon and Neo Zeon, the logical consequence of Psychoframe technology and new type mysticism taken to the extreme, for better or worse, and it also manages to be a sequel of sorts to Char's counterattack, but at the same time keep things enclosed in its own relatively small scale so that it doesn't interfere with Hathaway's Flash, the original spiritual sequel story of Char's Rebellion. So yeah, considering it's jam-packed with lore and characters, Unicorn works best when you know the entire series. As of the plot in itself, it's kind of silly when you think about it. The Laplace box is an artifact so powerful, a prayer and or curse so overwhelming that it could overthrow the entire Earth Federation. Yet, it has been kept secret for almost 100 years with no rumors, no leakage, not a single piece of information about it, and all of a sudden, everyone wants to do something with it. The good thing is that the show takes it super seriously and without any sense of silliness, so the chase for the Laplace box does work when you accept the context. Having said that, my name is Absa, and before we explore the events of Gundam Unicorn, here's a little disclaimer. There will obviously be spoilers in this video, so if you haven't seen Unicorn, Char's counterattack, the original Mobile Suit Gundam, Zeta or Double Zeta, and maybe narrative, well, I don't know what you are doing here, but I'll try my best to explain Gundam Unicorn without ruining the entirety of the experience. And also, I haven't read the original novels, so I may be missing some information. So please feel free to leave your comments. And now, on to the context of Gundam Unicorn. Gundam Unicorn is, to this date, the only main Gundam story of Universal Century to be not written by Yoshiyuki Tomino. Neither does Gundam Narrative, but that movie is more like an epilogue to Unicorn and not so much a standalone series. And you may be asking, but Absa, Tomino didn't wrote The Origin or Thunderbolt or Stardust Memories, and those are also entries for Universal Century. And you are correct. Tomino hasn't written all of the UC, but the main events are mostly his. Mobile Suit Gundam, Zeta, Double Zeta, Char's Counterattack, Hathaway's Flash, F91 and Victory. So, Unicorn being not written by him was something without precedence back in the early 2000s when the novels were being released. The author of Mobile Suit Gundam Unicorn is none other than Harutoshi Fukui, with mechanical designs by the legendary Hajime Katoki and characters designed by Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, the OG character designer from way back from the original series. Fukui is an interesting and controversial author to say the least. In a 2005 interview with the New York Times, he is described as working with a couple of similar themes ranging from a post-war mistaken path for Japan, their wounded pride, the sense of stagnation today, to even a need for a virile military. This is said to resonate in a Japan wanting to shed its pacifism and rearm itself. He is also very vocal about the fact that many people think that Japan is stumbling forward, going all the way to say, and I quote, "We want to change. Something is wrong with us now. Somehow we feel we've come to a dead end." In this kind of age, there is a possibility that characters who hold grudges will emerge in the real world. And even though extremists are destroyed in his stories, they are much more attractive than the heroes because the good guys, and I quote, have no strong vision. Is he talking about Vanager and full frontal? Okay, let's pause a little bit here. As I said in previous Gundam videos, I'm not here to talk about contemporary politics, nor I am qualified to do so. In this case, I brought up this topic because Fukui's worldview is clearly pro-military, whereas Tomino's worldview is totally against it. Gundam Unicorn's aesthetics feature heavily the images of mobile suits being super cool with a lot of emphasis on spectacular battles between grunts. Yet, we hardly ever see or hear from the pilots. It's almost as if the story is trying to glorify combat. In reality, it's not, at least not in the animation. I can talk about the novels. This mood contrasts a lot with previous Gundam series, so when Gundam Unicorn first started to come out, a lot of people were concerned with the new direction that Universal Century was heading. A new era where combat was encouraged and also heavily emphasized. Even the new uniforms and mobile suits of the Neo Zeon Army, also known as the Sleeves, were much more stylized and cool. Hell, the Sinanju is one of my favorite mobile suits to this day, but I digress. Now, here's the thing. From what I understand, the animation downplayed a lot of that pro-militarism, and Vanaji, being an extremely emotional main character, balanced very well the super stoic and cold attitude of antagonist Full Frontal. And I mean, yeah, Unicorn's themes and messages feel a little bit different from previous series, but in the big picture, the story doesn't change that much the whole Universal Century panorama. And to be fair, it's a series that aired approximately 17 years after Gundam Victory, the previous entry of Universal Century, so it's fair to say that this was a totally new era of anime where spectacle and technical prowess in animation was to be expected. So, does Gundam Unicorn have a very different feel and way of exploring its themes than the rest of the UC? Yes. Does it heavily emphasize combat and military pride? To a certain extent. But this is Gundam, and we can talk about Gundam without talking about war and military faction. But this is the important question. Does the author's motives and themes permeate the work so much that it does indeed change people's point of view about peace and militarism? That I don't know. From a design standpoint, I do find much more interesting all of the psionic imagery, but I'm still a man of peace. Yet, 1, I'm not that young and impressionable, and 2, I'm not from Japan nor born in the USA, so all of that militaristic history and antics between them is way beyond me. To be honest, with my knowledge, that's all I can say. But let's do something. I have a friend who is getting a master's degree in Japanese history, but the thing is, he doesn't like Gundam. I'll try to convince him to check out a couple of episodes of Unicorn, particularly those where Full Frontal speaks about the side co-prosperity sphere, and then maybe we can record a podcast where we explore the connection between the Sleeves, imperialism, and the newer Japanese militaristic worldview of some. I don't promise anything, but I'll do my best to try and convince him. Now, with that important piece of Gundam Unicorn's context laid out, we can now move on onto the story of the Beast of Possibility and the mysterious Laplace box. Gundam Unicorn happens in UC 0096, 3 years after Char's counterattack and like 10 years before Mafdis' uprising in Hathaway's Flash. The date is important because there were not a lot of things happening in that decade, so Fukui definitely chose it carefully to be able to add and retcon things without interfering much in the overall timeline. I like to understand and interpret all of Universal Century's event as kind of a hypertime, a continuity where everything happens and everything is canon to a certain extent. To all my friends who like comics, this is nothing new. And to be able to understand Sunrise Vision that everything animated is canon, here's where the concept of hypertime works best to explain Universal Century. You see, there are many variant endings and retells of certain events: the fall of Aobaoku, the demise of Paptimus, Char and Haman's relation, the whole second Neo Zeon War, to name a few. The truth is that everything happened in one way or the other, and that's the important part, not the details of how it happened. For example, the Axis shock happened, period. It doesn't really matter if it happened exactly as depicted on Char's counterattack or Belter Chica's children. The key takeaway here is that events and characters adjust to the benefit of the overarching plot, not the other way around, even if it feels weird and contradicts something else. That's why we can have the Laplace box hunt happening in between Char's rebellion and the appearance of the Sleeves and the Beast Foundation without them being mentioned at all in Hathaway's flesh, that we know of yet. But that's my way of accepting the malleability or hypertime of Universal Century, and well, maybe you may not like it. Back to Gundam Unicorn, seen as a whole and aside from Minerva's final Laplace declaration, it's a really small-scale story that recontextualizes a lot of early Universal Century conflicts and sheds a new light on certain important ideologies. For example, one of the main questions I had while watching every Gundam series after Zeta was, why did the Zeons kept insisting on overturning the Federation? I mean, the original Gundam with the Zavis Principality made sense. Stardust's memory with the Delas fleet also made sense and gave great background to the Titans. But after that, why did Zeon kept warring the Federation? And in Unicorn, that gets explained as Marita Cruz tells Vanagi that Zeon's Zum Daikon ideology is kind of a replaced religion as a symbol of hope for the Space Noids. It's actually a great analogy as she tells him that the light of the sun no longer reaches some colonies, so people there had to find a new light source. And Zeon, as an ideology, a movement, a resistance, replaced the light of the sun. And that's a great in-story justification, a great reframing of the continuous use of Zeon and why members of that side helped every insurrection from Haman's to Char's to even the new one led by Full Frontal. It's a very poetic way to show how an ideology transformed to a cult and why, after 3 great wars, there are still people siding along their military and civilian ranks. This is Zeon's final stance before they get reabsorbed by the Federation. This is their final war, so they decide to go out with a bang. With that said, the story of Gundam Unicorn is simple. 3 years after Char's rebellion, a group of Zeonic remnant terrorists known as the Sleeves are hunting a secret artifact that can finally overturn the Federation. On the other side, we have the Beast Foundation, who has worked with the Federation since day one to hide said artifact, and we also have a couple of new experimental mobile suits from Anaheim Electronics who may or may not know what they built. One of those creations was taken by the Beast Foundation to change the operating system to include some coordinates because the head of the Foundation was getting tired of holding the secret artifact. So, if the almost sentient operating system of the mobile suit found its pilot worthy, it would reveal the path to the discovery of the Laplace box, the mysterious curse and prayer of all of Universal Century. Now let's talk about the key players. First, we have Vanager Lynx, the pilot of the Unicorn Gundam, the mobile suit also known as the key to the Laplace box. Vanagi is a very curious character because he starts as a super whiny kid who immediately finds its purpose in life when he senses a girl named Audrey Byrne. But towards the end, we realize that he's an incredibly sensitive and aware new type, which can be better summarized as an incredibly powerful new type. So, as a new type, he felt an immediate connection with with Audrey. And with that connection, just like Lala with Amuro and Char, he knew that there was hope for a better tomorrow. I have to say that that connection at first seems super forced. It really feels supernatural. But then we realize that it's exactly like that because they are new types and they can connect on that deep level at first sight. The first time I saw the series, I didn't understood that, so I hated Banagi. But now, I get why his character development had to be like that. Oh, and he's also the son of Cardia's Beast, he who was responsible for the formatting of the Unicorn Gundam. That makes him the great-grandson of Cyan Beast, the founder of the Beast Foundation. And about the Unicorn, well, this experimental mobile suit is the next step in Psycho-Frame technology as the whole mobile suit has Psycho-Frame armor, not just the cockpit. From a mechanical design perspective, it's truly a great accomplishment. The Unicorn Gundam has two modes. The normal one that looks like a very plain white mobile suit with a horn-like antenna in the forehead, and the legend goes that this Gundam is completely white because it's a nod to the original RX-78-2 being called the White Devil. The thing is that there's also a secret mode for the mobile suit, one that is activated by the NTD system, the new type destroyer system. When the Unicorn awakens, all of the Psycho Frame armor starts to glow and opens, and in a great design trick, the horn splits in two and forms the classic V-fin of all of the Gundams. I'll admit that the Unicorn design is not my favorite, yet I have to acknowledge that it's a very clever and elegant design. Also, the NTD system is a great story element that ties very well with the Laplace box, but I'll talk more about it later. Back to the characters, Audrey Byrne, who in reality is Mineva Lao Sabi, is the rightful heir to the Zeon throne that was a baby when her father Dossel died defending Solomon, and whom we haven't seen since Double Zeta Gundam. She is a great character because from the beginning she wanted to stop war, and that makes sense. Since she was there when the Sabis did their thing in 0079, she was there to see the fall of the Titans, and she was also there when Haman's Neo Zeon fell. She is adamant to stop the Beast Foundation from giving the Laplace box to the Zeon remnants because that would be adding more fuel to the fire. That's also why she's been hiding as Audrey Byrne so that they could not use her last name for leverage. All in all, Mineva is a little bit better than a damsel in distress. She is more like a diplomat with a great peaceful ambition, and as a somewhat war veteran, she has more emotional maturity than Vanagir. Her character works because she is there to fulfill the idea of her father that a Sabi could stop a war and be a better human. And well, we can't talk about Mineva and the Unicorn Gundam without talking about the tapestry now called The Lady and the Unicorn, a Monzul Desir, to my sole desire. This is a real-world tapestry of unknown author that has 6 variants. 5 more or less representing the senses, and the final that says a Monzul Desir, a phrase that also happens to be said a couple of times in the series. In that particular 6th tapestry, which is a little bit more complex than all of the others, there's a noble lady who's moving her hand towards a chest or box, and the unicorn and the lion to her sides. What's interesting is that one interpretation sees that tapestry as representing a 6th sense of understanding. Subtle Fukui is being subtle. Jokes aside, that tapestry more or less sums up the main plot elements of Gundam Unicorn. A noble lady trying to do something with the open box, and the unicorn and the lion helping her, even though the lion almost looks like it's going to eat her. There's also a little dog right besides her and the lion, and well, we all know how Riri clinged all puppy-like to her at the beginning, but more of him later. The box, which in reality is the original Universal Century Charter that included a clause in favor of the new types, and yeah, that's the whole secret, can be further interpreted as a modern open Pandora's box, that despite of all the evils being released into the world, the curse of the Federation, at the bottom of the box was the power of hope, the prayer of the new tapes. Such power was to help humanity overcome all the chaos and evils, make the Federation acknowledge the Space Noids and give them representation as stated by the Charter. Yet, if Hope's power was used incorrectly or abused, Zeon utilizing it to continue their warlike and separatist ways, it would retaliate against humanity and would turn into despair. Another brutal one-year war. That's probably what Cyan Beast and Mineva meant with the Laplace box revelation destroying the world. The problem is that it was all just a possibility. Gundam Unicorn's entire thesis is that unlocking the Laplace box and revealing the true charter wouldn't necessarily change the world. It would only create a possibility for the world to change. And Gundam being Gundam, we know that Hathaway's Flash story just happens to be the scenario where that possibility simply didn't happen. It's sad, but it had to be like that for future Universal Centuries events, unless Sunrise decides to do something super radical in the Hathaway's trilogy. The box did matter, and it had the power to do something if humanity was willing to do something. But, like Full Frontal said about Axis Shock, even when presented with the possibility of such magnitude, humanity didn't change its ways. That can be said of every Universal Century event, from the OG One-Year War to the third Neo-Zeon War, and that is in line with Tomino's original view of Gundam. So yeah, the apple didn't fall that far from the tree. And speaking of Full Frontal, man, he's a super weird character that carries a lot of implications. Let me explain. By the time that Gundam Unicorn was being released, the concept of a Char clone was a staple of Gundam, a blonde, masked rebel that was not entirely a villain, yet not entirely a hero. But the concept of a true clone had never been explored, except a Franchi Char from Gaia Gear, but that is a whole other story for a whole other video. Full Frontal is a genetically altered human to look like Char, cybernetically altered to be a new type, and also he had Char's memories implanted with the aid of the Psycho Frame that was left in the Sazabi. How? Well, in Gundam narrative we learned that Neo Zeon had in fact a complete program called something like the Second Coming of Char, whose main interest was to manufacture clones of Char, and apparently Full Frontal was the epitome. Later, we also learned that he was so perfect because he truly possessed a fraction of Char's soul. So not only was he literally the first Char clone, but at the same time he was still Char. Here's where things get a little bit more weird and are explained a little bit better in the novel. Even though he knew he was a clone, for all practical purposes, Full Frontal was Char. But he was a little bit different. He was completely devoid of passion. He was a much more practical Char with little to no heroism left in him, since the fragment of soul or spirit that he possessed was the part that got distorted in despair because humanity didn't change after the Axis shock. But still, he had the amazing charisma and pilot skills of the original, allowing him to become Neo Zeon's commander and obviously piloting a red mobile suit that was the terror of the Federation. The thing with Full Frontal is that he knew that he was a clone, but acted as if he was the original because of what that meant for the people. Imagine Neo Zeon telling the Space Noids that their hero and savior Char was back and that he was still fighting for them. Frontal was a symbol, and he acted accordingly, with none of the ghost that plagued the original, so he was brutally effective. Now imagine, as a fan of Gundam, seeing Char again, because when he first unmasks, he is Char, along with his super iconic voice. That's pure fan service done in a good way, because the story keeps his true past as a mystery, and it's only when they are discussing the Laplace box where we learn that he is a false Char. It's actually Mineva who truly understands that Char was dead because Frontal had a different approach to the box and the future of the Space Noids. Full Frontal knew that in reality the Laplace box meant nothing, that the Earth Noids would never accept the Space Noids, and even if there were new types, as told by the Charter, the Federation was actively trying to get rid of them using the entity system installed in the newest mobile suits, including the Unicorn. This way, the Federation could keep their control over Space Noids by making sure that the threat of the new types stated in the Charter as the space-adapted species of human ceased to exist. That meant that even if the secret got exposed, there weren't going to be any new types left. But Frontal was a little bit more practical than everyone, as he was planning to use the secret of the Laplace box only to buy some extra time for the Space Noids to band together and completely forgo the Federation. That way, if all of the Space Noids boycott the Earth of their resources, the Earth Noids would be forced to abandon the Earth. A plan with an outcome identical to Char's original plan, but done in a much more calculated and cold way, so that the existence of the new types was rendered irrelevant and the Principality of Zeon was at the center of the side co-prosperity sphere project. And for him, it had to be that way because in UC100, Zeon's autonomy would be revoked, so his plan couldn't wait that much time. More or less, that's his story and motives for this small but nonetheless third Neo-Zeon war. Moving on, the lion is the other important animal that appears in the tapestry, and in the story, the lion represents the unicorn's mobile suit brother, the Banshee. This mobile suit is first piloted by Marita Cruz, who is in reality Ple 12, the 12th clone of Elpa Ple from Double Zeta. And this was a nice bit of fan service or callback to a previous Gundam series. She is a cyber new type who was rescued by Neo-Zeon and originally the pilot of the Kshatriya, but she was then captured and repurposed by the Beast Foundation to pilot the Banshee. Marita is kind of a Lala stand-in as she guides and mentors Banaji into the thoughts of the Zeons and also to always cherish the light and the warmth in people, even though she was a very stoic woman. Her role is very important to Banaji, aiding him greatly in times of need. On the other hand, we have Mr. Riri Marcenas, the second pilot of the Banshee. He is a very brutal character, not in a good way. He starts as a nice and cool pilot, but everything changes when he gets to know Audrey Byrne and her true identity as a Sabi. He is also burdened by the weight of his last name, as the Marcenas are very closely related to the Federation, with his great-grandfather Ricardo Marcenas being the first Prime Minister. By revealing his backstory and knowing the background of Mineva, he believed that they were two sides of the same coin that could stay locked away from everything and start anew. The thing was that Mineva wanted to take action and change the world for the better, so she went with Banaji and that broke Riri. He then went on to pilot the Banshee to destroy the Unicorn and Banaji. Well, it's a little bit more complex than that, but the truth is that I didn't like this character. But that doesn't mean that he's a bad character. In fact, he's a very well constructed character, the complete opposite of Banaji. His mobile suit and uniform are black. His last name is important, as was Banaji, yet Riri could never get rid of it. He hated Gundams and new types even though he was piloting a Gundam and was a new type. He works very well to illustrate how Banaji could have gone wrong if he had stayed as part of the Beast family, being loyal to the Federation and didn't had any contact and support from Marita, Mineva, and all of the Zeonic crew in the Garen Sears. With all of them, Banaji got to understand both sides of the conflict, but Riri, poor Riri, never had that, so he was a very troubled individual. Anyway, that's more or less the story and background of the most important players of Gundam Unicorn. So finally, it's time to go ahead and talk very fast about the whole plot. At the start of the story, it's more or less a typical Gundam show where a boy without any piloting skills stumbles upon the mobile suit and then he gets to know the horrors of war by unwillingly participating on it. Here we have more or less three parties: the Federation, joined by Anheim Electronics and the bad part of the Beast Foundation, who want to stop the secret of the box from falling into the wrong hands, the good part of the Beast Foundation, led by the founder Cyan Beast, who wants to do something with the box, and finally the Sleeps, or Neo-Zeon, who want the box to liberate the Space Note with its power, whatever that means. The whole story of Gundam Unicorn is more or less a chase around certain important parts or places that meant something for the Universal Century Calendar. Throughout all of those adventures, we see the many sides of Zeon and the Federation, with Space Noids believing in the light of Zeon's philosophy and other Zeons who stayed on Earth who are now consumed by rage. We also get to know more about the super shady practices of Anheim Electronics, who gave mobile suits to both sides of the conflict, and also that inside the Federation there are still people with heart, like my man Bright Noah. As I said before, Banagher never lost his hope or innocence because he was able to find a way to reconcile the ideas of Mineva, Marida, Bright, Zinnerman, Siam, and even the Gusa from the Manhunters of the Federation. Throughout his adventures, he grows into a confident man and a powerful new type who is capable of controlling the entity system and use the unicorn to perform acts that may or may not be considered miracles. In the end, he and Mineva finally get to Magellanica, where Siam Beast resides and where the original Universal Centuries Charter, the Laplace Box, is located. But obviously, Mr. Frontal also got there to steal the charter for Neo Zeon. And well, up until now, the unicorn had shown certain special abilities along the lines of the Axis Shock. This is now known as the Psycho Field, a unique property of the Psycho Frame that converts the user's will into energy. And here is where Neo Zeon and Frontal show their trump card, the Neo Zeong, a mobile armor so massive that dwarfs the original Zeong. The structure is so big that it houses the full Sinanju in its chest and has like 6 arms, 2 big thrusters instead of legs, funnel bits that can hijack other enemy mobile suits, and Psycho Shards, a large Psychomo armament that was given by Char's soul from a higher plane of existence and is supposedly capable of actualizing Full Frontal's thoughts. Full Frontal wanted the box, so he went full on against the unicorn, and even though Reedy accepted his fate and joined Banagher, they were totally defenseless since the Psycho Shard disabled their weapons. But the unicorn, the beast of possibility, defied everything and went straight on towards the Sinanju, and the wills of both Banagher and Frontal started to resonate, just like with Axis Shock. But the clone is not impressed. In fact, he claims that nothing will change and decides to take Banagher to a trip through time. How? Well, with the power of the Psycho Shards and Psycho Frame, he guides the Psycho Energy so that Banagher can experience the flow and the tears of time. What happens next is left ambiguous, as Frontal might be just dumping vivid memories of the past and a possible future to Banagher, or they can truly be traveling through time. Believe what you prefer. What Frontal wanted to show Banagher was that at the end of time, everything will be a black and empty void with no meaning whatsoever. But Banagher, embodying the hope of the new types, refuses to succumb to that fate and decides to defy it. That's when he returns to consciousness to defeat the Sinanju. And then something very poetic happens. As the unicorn is defeating and destroying the Sinanju, the warm light of the Psycho Field envelopes the red mobile suit. Frontal, in a state of pure denial despite everything, is then visited by the spirits of Lala, Amuro, and even the original Char Aznable. Char then tells him that it's time for him to go, and Lala, being the ever-positive new type, says that this light is what warms the very universe, that this warm energy is not only the proof but also the inspiration that a different future can exist, that miracles can happen again and again if there's a sufficiently big will to bring them forth. Frontal then proceeds to tell Banagher that the future is now in his hands, and as his fragment of soul starts to depart, the whole Sinanju and his body starts to deteriorate. But this is not the end. Remember the bad part of the Beast Foundation and the Earth Federation? They still don't want the secret of the box to be out there in the public, so they fire the colony laser. Yes, Grips 2. That colony laser from Zeta is fired again towards Magellanica in an attempt to obliterate everything and everyone. But remember that thing about miracles that I'd said before? Well, Banagher, as a full new type, uses the unicorn as a shield, and with the help of Reedy and the Banshee, they are able to stop the laser without any damage whatsoever. And as the mobile suit fleet was approaching, the now awakened unicorn stopped them in their tracks by a magical new type Psycho Framey wave of hand. This is something that I didn't like and would be better explained in narrative, so I won't delve too much here. The final act is that Banagher comes out of his near-death experience as a full new type with the unicorn unscathed. Now, with the fleet stopped, Cyan Beast, as his final wheel, connects all of the communication systems everywhere and enables Minerva to deliver her speech about the secret of the Universal Centuries Charter and the fate of the humans in space and on the Earth sphere. Okay, let's take a breath here. Saying that this was a very controversial ending is kind of an understatement. The new tape and or Psycho-Frame magic displayed here was very exaggerated. Was it spectacular? Definitely yes. Is it the plausible next step of the Psycho-Frame and new tape abilities that appeared in Char's counterattack? Probably. Did I like it? I don't know. A part of me just wants to like it, to accept the Unicorn Gundam as a real robot that ascended to the super robot category. But another part of me feels that it's way too much. I mean, design-wise, the look of the unicorn glowing with psycho energy is amazing. But is it too out there? For me, it's just 2 steps too far from what my suspension of disbeliefs allow me to accept. Just 2 steps. The psycho energy time rewinding handwave was what killed me. Everything else can be interpreted as something that happened in the astral new type plane or as a miracle of all the wheels that wanted to stop the colony laser. And many people thought that the stopping of the colony laser or the revelation that Full Frontal was indeed a part of Char cheapened what happened in the Axis shock, but I don't think so. The Axis shock was felt by many and actually witnessed by a lot of humans. That's why it is still remembered in Hathaway's Flash. But what happened with the Unicorn and the laser was of a much smaller scale, so that's why the Federation was able to keep it away from the public eye, and also it goes to show us that sometimes there are humans that even if they are hit on the face with a miracle, they won't believe it and will keep on doing the same mistakes. This display of power also justifies why Psycho-Frame technology advances are halted, kept secret, and never mentioned again in future Gundam entries. And well, if the story of Gundam Unicorn would have stopped here, maybe I wouldn't be complaining. The problem was that after the success of this series, Sunrise decided to add a kind of epilogue. This would tell the story of the 3rd Unicorn brother, the Phoenix, a new attack from the remnant of 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 Neo Zeon, and a new Char clone gone extremely wrong. Oh, and if you thought that the Unicorn stopping the colony laser with new type magic was extreme, don't worry. Gundam Narrative takes new type magic totally out of the field and to ridiculous levels. But I'll talk about that story in another video. First of all, if you're still here, thank you very much for staying till the end, and I'm sorry for making such lengthy videos, but there is so much to say. All in all, Gundam Unicorn is a good series. It reinvigorated Universal Century and retconned some concepts so that they felt a little bit more serious and relevant. I did like it, even the new type magic of the end. And what I liked the most was the fact that the story was constructed in such a way that even though huge things happened, in reality they were small and self-contained as only a couple of people witnessed them. That's why there was no legend of a mobile suit capable of stopping a colony laser in the MAFT or F91 era. The story is done in such a way that it can coexist with the rest of the timeline and doesn't contradict or change it that much. And coming from a comics background, I like that Fukui respected the continuity of Gundam. Many people say that Unicorn is their favorite UC series, and I can understand why. It has a more modern approach to storytelling and the visuals are amazing. And there are probably people who do enjoy the new type magic. My final thoughts about the series is that it revamped a lot of the concept of the UC and made them relevant again. Maybe too relevant and ubiquitous because now it feels weird and repetitive that Mafti is also known as the second coming of Char. But more of that much later. Anyway, I hope you liked my way of explaining and analyzing Gundam Unicorn without going full summary, and I know that I missed tons of interesting points, so please tell me in the comments what are your thoughts of the controversial Gundam Unicorn. And as you may or may not know, my name is Absa, and we can continue the conversation over at Twitter, where you can follow me at Absalonicus, and on Instagram, where I post pictures of my figures, my cats, and sometimes even myself. I'll be trying to talk more about anime, comics, and maybe even figures. Until next time, always remember that in fiction lies power, so let's use it to forge a new type of story, our hero's journey.